Hello, biology students. I wanted to just kind of finish up the notes for this unit. We're pretty much done. We went through all the cell organelles. We talked about different types of transport. We talked about active versus passive and kind of what the difference is. And I want to talk a little bit really quickly. So the visual that you're seeing here with this video is obviously this is what you should have seen with our vinegar and corn syrup with the eggs that you finished up when I was gone. And hopefully you saw a difference between the two eggs. Hopefully you saw in the vinegar that, the egg actually increased in mass. In the corn syrup, it kind of shriveled, and you should have been able to see that. So that expect to see that on the test, questions about that, so make sure that you understand that. I will be back on Thursday, so you can ask me questions if you're not really clear on that. So I wanted to continue on anyway with active and passive transport. There's a little bit more we have to go through. We talked about the cell membrane really kind of being policing what goes in and out of the cell, and that there's a lot of membranes embedded in that cell membrane. Some of those membrane proteins participate or aid in something called facilitated diffusion. So it's still diffusion. Remember when I put food coloring in the water and we said, that things, naturally want to diffuse from an area where they're more concentrated to an area where they're less concentrated? Facilitated diffusion is the same, except that there's some proteins that, again, carrier molecules that kind of speed up that diffusion process a little bit. So we're still talking about it's going in an area where things are more concentrated and it's diluting out to where it's less concentrated. So facilitated diffusion is a passive transport with carrier proteins that just kind of speed that process up. Sometimes that means it's an ion channel that moves ions through that membrane as well. So that's kind of it for passive transport. We talked about, water moving through the membrane as a type of passive transport. Oxygen and carbon dioxide moving through as part of passive transport. So let's talk a little bit now about active transport. So active transport, remember we said active people use energy to do things, and active transport also uses energy in the form of this ATP molecule. So ATP is that energy molecule for the cell. We talked about ATP being made in the mitochondria. And so this is where some of that ATP is going to be used up. So active transport, there's several different kinds. One kind is something called a sodium-potassium pump. Sodium-potassium are those electrolytes that are really, really important in cell function. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail with that, but this actually requires energy for your cells to maintain those proper sodium and potassium levels in the cells. So that's one type of active transport. And then endocytosis and exocytosis. So again, these are active transport. Endo means into, so we always remember endo meaning enter, into. This is a process where cells engulf things that are just really too big to go through even those protein channels in the cell membrane. And we further break this down into two separate types of endocytosis. Penocytosis, which means moving fluid into the cell, and phagocytosis means to move large food particles into the cell. And in this process, the cell literally surrounds these things that it wants to bring into the cell. It fuses with the cell membrane and opens up inside of the cell. So hopefully you could see by the little video clip sort of how those kind of vesicles kind of move into and out of the cell through that cell membrane. So it literally fuses with the cell membrane and it releases a vesicle inside, which then is released inside of the cell. Just the opposite is happening in exocytosis. It's taking it out of the cell and releasing it outside of the cell. So this is the way that cells actually get nutrition in. So when you eat food and it gets broken down into smaller and smaller particles, it's still probably too large to go through those membrane proteins. And so that nutrition comes into the cell through the process of endocytosis. Likewise, some proteins are for use outside of the cells, and so those have to get exported out of the cells. So I think this is kind of a nice visual of what that might look like. So this represents that cell membrane. Remember, the security guard that kind of controls what goes into and out of the cells. And as these particles become close to the cell membrane kind of makes a little trough here, a little well, if you will. These particles go into this little divot, and eventually this is going to pinch off completely and form a closed wall, and then it releases this vesicle inside of the cell, and then it's going to go find its purpose. And with exocytosis, it's just the opposite. It's exiting the cell. Sometimes those are proteins, again, that are going to be used outside of the cell. Sometimes it's waste that the cell just wants to get rid of. And then all of this, endocytosis, exocytosis, and the transport through the cell membrane, it's all a really important part of homeostasis. That maintaining of internal conditions really begins in the cell. Both passive and active transport maintain those constant internal conditions of fluids and solutes in the cell. Again, this is just another visual kind of showing that both endocytosis and exocytosis. So obviously you should be writing this all in your notes. And then this is just the very last slide, just a recap of we talked about the different types of cell transport. We talked about passive transport, and then we talked about active transport. So there's two types of transport that we talked about. When we discussed passive transport, we said diffusion, like the drop of food coloring in the water, or like I said, the kid who pees in the swimming pool, right? That diffuses through the entire swimming pool. This does not use energy. That's a key component of passive. We talked about a person who's passive, just being real chill, go with the flow kind of person. It goes with the natural concentration gradient. So nature doesn't like a concentration gradient. It always wants to dilute everything. So this is all about diluting, going from areas where things are more concentrated to less concentrated. We talked about diffusion, osmosis, which is movement of water through a membrane, and then that facilitated diffusion. It's still diffusion, it's just diffusion that's using proteins in the membrane to kind of help it through. And then the types of active transport, active always uses energy. And in cells, we know the energy that's used is that ATP, that adenosine triphosphate. This goes against a concentration gradient sometimes. Not always, but if something goes against a concentration gradient, it's always active transport. There's always some energy that's required to do that. So we talked about endocytosis and exocytosis, moving large particles into and out of. Those are types of active transport. They don't go against a concentration gradient per se, but they do require energy. And then the sodium and potassium pump is a really specific one for regulating those electrolytes, those sodium and potassium ions inside of our cells. And that's it for this unit.